Okay, it's just hit 1 o'clock, and we are here today. Delighted to have you here. My name is Ruth Clinton, and I'm Industry Engagement and Partnerships Manager here at E3 in Trinity. And we are delighted to introduce you today to today's session as part of the Balanced Solutions for a Better World monthly webinar series. So before we begin today, I'd just like to take a moment to introduce E3. E3 is Engineering, Environment and Emerging Technologies. It's an ambitious initiative here at Trinity College Dublin. E3 is about innovation, collaboration and sustainability. So by bringing together the schools of engineering, natural science and computer science and statistics, we are creating a multidisciplinary hub where groundbreaking research and education intersect to address grand and global challenges. So E3 is about sustainability, so equipping students with knowledge and skills to create a future that is both sustainable and equitable, education and growth, expanding STEM education at Trinity and increasing student numbers by over a third in the next decade. And we're leading research, so investing in cutting edge facilities and technologies to drive breakthroughs in science and technology. So through E3, Trinity is positioning Ireland as a global leader in STEM education and research, ensuring our graduates are at the forefront of innovation. We're shaping the engineers, the scientists and technology leaders who will build a better future for all. This webinar series is all about bringing together leading experts, practitioners and innovators from around the world who all contribute to tackle some of the biggest challenges that we face: climate action, biodiversity, conservation, sustainable cities, renewable energies, and so much more. So each month we are exploring creative, multidisciplinary solutions that bridge the science, the policy, and the practice to build a more sustainable and equitable future. So whether you're a researcher, a policymaker, a student, or somebody simply who cares about the environment and the future of our planet, and these webinars are your chance to engage with us and engage with our thought leaders to gain new insights and be inspired to take action. So we are delighted to have you all here today, and would sincerely like to thank you. So we hope you enjoy this session very much. So it's with immense pleasure I'd like to introduce our speaker today as part of our Balanced Solutions for a Better World online webinar series. A world-class ecologist, a dedicated leader in sustainability and climate, and a true force for environmental policy. Professor Yvonne Buckley serves as the Professor of Zoology at Trinity College Dublin, where she channels her passion for the natural world into cutting-edge research. She's dedicated quantitative ecologist, and her core mission is to understand the fundamental drivers of animal and plant population processes in our rapidly changing world. Through powerful combination of field data, lab work, quantitative modelling, her research provides the scientific support for critical world decisions in biodiversity conservation, invasive species management, habitat restoration, and the fight against climate change. This high impact work has resulted in numerous highly cited papers and has earned her a position as senior editor for the prestigious Journal of Ecology. Professor Buckley is also the co-director of the Co-Centre for Climate, Biodiversity and Water, a major research hub linking 14 institutions across Ireland, Northern Ireland and the UK. She is a director for both Dublin Zoo and Ireland's National Biodiversity Data Centre, and serves as a key member of Ireland's Climate Change Advisory Council. She's also director of the very newly established AIB Trinity Climate Hub. Professor Buckley is not just shaping policy, she is shaping public understanding, sharing her knowledge through a monthly science column in the Irish Times also. So from her roots in North Cork to her academic achievements, including a first-class BA from Oxford and a PhD from Imperial College London, Professor Buckley exemplifies scientific knowledge, excellence, and environmental stewardship. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over the session to Professor Yvonne Buckley. Thanks, Professor Buckley.
Thanks, Ruth, for that really lovely introduction. And I'm delighted to be giving this webinar to you all here today. So I'm just going to go straight into it. So hopefully you can see my screen, and I'm just going to put it into presentation mode. Okay, is that okay, Ruth?
Yes, perfect.
Brilliant. Okay, so as Ruth said, I'm a co-director of this really exciting multi-institutional international research centre called Climate Plus, the Co-Centre for Climate Plus Biodiversity and Water. So there's over 100 researchers involved across 14 different institutions in Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the rest of the UK on the island of Great Britain. And it's a really exciting transboundary, transdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary research centre tackling the climate, biodiversity and water crises. And this is because those crises are interlinked and we can't tackle one without touching on the others. And we need to find those areas of solution space that minimize trade-offs and maximize co-benefits across that whole space. And then within Trinity, I'm director of the AIB Trinity Climate Hub. So this is a research enabling unit, a research and education enabling unit, strengthening and expanding Trinity's world-class climate, biodiversity and water research, because Trinity's researchers do a lot more than what happens in the co-centre, what happens in my research group. There's over 300 or 400 people across college, academics at least, that do something touching on climate and nature. So we're looking to strengthen and expand Trinity's world-class climate, biodiversity and water research and education environment through interdisciplinary collaboration, engagement, leadership development and support across the board. So hopefully you'll be hearing more about the AIB Trinity Climate Hub going forward. The other reason I've put this slide up here is that I think this is a really nice introduction to climate change and our place in dealing with climate change. This is the front of Trinity College Dublin, right in the centre of Dublin City. And last October, we projected Ed Hawkins' climate stripes graphic onto the front of Trinity. So each stripe here is a year, with 1850 down here in the blue area, and running all the way through to 2024 up in the red area over here. So this is a really nice graphical way of showing how our climate, this is the Irish mean temperature, from 1850 to 2024, how that temperature has changed over the last 170 something years. And projecting it onto the front of Trinity, I think has quite an effect for people who are working in and around Trinity, because Trinity's been around for a long time, 425 years, and we hope it'll be around for a very long time to come. But by projecting the climate stripes here onto Trinity, we can see that the world is changing around this august and long-lived institution. And the institution will have to work hard to try and limit and prevent further climate change and reverse it ultimately. But also this institution, this university, is going to have to work hard to adapt to the changing climate and the changing situation. And that means that we need research right across the different areas of scientific and social sciences and health inquiry and arts and humanities, all working together to both mitigate and adapt to climate change. So that's the climate stripes projected onto the front of Trinity. This is what they look like, just in a little bit more detail. They are clearly showing that warming is happening. These are the global climate stripes, and Ed Hawkins is actually the Great Britain lead for the Co-Centre for Climate Plus Biodiversity and Water. So we're very lucky to have him in the fold. So we know the climate's changing. We've also got plenty of evidence that it is also declining. So here we have the biodiversity stripes put together by Miles Richardson based on Ed Hawkins's concept of the climate stripes. And these run from 1970 to 2020. And the data underlying these stripes, again, every stripe is a year. The data underlying these stripes is the Living Planet Index. And you can see that it goes from green, a high value for that index, all the way through now in 2020 to grey, which is basically a 73% decline in that Living Planet Index, which is the underlying populations of plants and animals that are monitored worldwide. And this is basically covers my lifetime. So I was born sometime around here in the green period, and I've lived through this decline. So again, by kind of projecting my you know, by projecting these stripes onto the course of my lifetime, it becomes more personal. And we're seeing these changes really, really clearly in real time within our own lifetimes. This isn't something abstract. It's not happening outside of our institutions and outside of our own lives. It really is right in the middle of what we're experiencing. So just to give you an idea of over that time period, what I have worked on, and I've been really, really interested in the ecology of people's interactions with nature for a very long time. I'm interested in how humans shape nature. I'm also really interested in how we intentionally manage nature for various reasons, including agriculture, invasive species, forests, freshwater ecosystems, zoos. I've worked across a range of different disciplines in order to bring those disciplines to bear on the questions that I'm interested in. I'm not an expert in all of these disciplines. I'm an ecologist, but I'm very, very happy to work with anthropologists, people who are experts in human behavior, people who are experts in technology and its deployment, people who are interested in collating evidence and putting it together for policymakers. And then ultimately, we're interested in looking at ecosystem management, and in particular, conservation and restoration strategies for biodiversity with co-benefits for water quality, water and flood mitigation, climate action, and climate mitigation, as well as the adaptation aspects. And I've been lucky enough to work in some really fantastic places in the world, including Turkey, where I looked at these gorgeous guys here, the white-headed ducks, a couple of species of trees in Mexico, and some dry scrub forest there. I've worked on many different invasive plant species. This one is called St. John's wort. It's native to Europe. And I worked on it in Australia, where it was really problematic weed of pasture systems. I've worked in New Zealand here. This is a big tower that we put up with ultrasonic anemometers to monitor wind turbulence, to try and figure out how fast these trees were spreading. These are non-native Corsican pine, invasive pine tree in New Zealand that are taking over natural grassland areas. And here I am in the Burren, where I have a couple of research sites that we've been monitoring for biodiversity and for population dynamics over the past 10 years or so. And then finally, I also work in policy spheres, as Ruth outlined, and this is just a reminder to me to talk to you about this later, about policy development and the role for research as providing the evidence base for policy development. So before I get into all of that heavy stuff, I thought I would show you a video. What has biodiversity ever done for us? So why are we interested in biodiversity? So before I go any further, can you hear that okay? Just give me a thumbs up, Ruth, if that's working.
I didn't hear the audio for it, Yvonne. Maybe you want to try it again?
Okay.
Hi. Okay. What's the hold up? A little bit of a rush.
Toads, my treasure.
I'm sorry, what?
They won't be long. Gorgeous little smashers.
Can you tell them I've got a meeting?
Just be a quick shake, my duck.
Shall I give them a lift?
Just nature, isn't it? Powerful yet gentle.
Precious nature. It's toads going with it. What has it ever done for us? I mean, actually done.
Well, plants make oxygen, which we need to breathe, and keeps us alive.
Okay, probably a fluke, but fine.
And they suck out the, what's it called? Carbon dioxide.
Dioxide, moron.
Lovely. Food, oil, water to drink, or to go skinny dipping.
Yeah, okay. The oxygen, the food, and the water.
Sun powers things. Literally make
These
important.
No thingy.
They do a lovely bit of pollinating.
it makes us less stressed.
All right, fine. But apart from sucking out the carbon, supplying us with oxygen, giving us soil to grow food, water to drink, solar energy to power things, bees that pollinate everything, generally keeping us healthy, and whatever you just said about being less stressed, what has nature ever done for us?
Blessed us with coriander.
Right, no. So coriander can just go and absolutely...
So I hope you enjoyed that. It's a video that I show sometimes, particularly to students. And I think it's quite a powerful way of illustrating two things. One is there's obviously really important contributions that nature makes to us people, but also that there are kind of tensions between how we live our lives and nature. So that there are some kind of tensions there that need to be resolved. So Ireland is in terms of its objectives and its targets, is in a good place. So we have a Climate Act that commits Ireland, in addition to being climate neutral, to being biodiversity rich by 2050. So it's written into our legislation. And that's a really important, an important thing, that within our climate legislation, we have this commitment to biodiversity rich. But currently in Ireland, biodiversity is in very poor condition and it's continuing to decline. So 85% of our Natura 2000 protected habitats are in unfavorable status, and many of them are continuing to decline. These are our most rare and protected habitats. Just 48% of our surface waters, 48% of our surface waters are in unsatisfactory ecological condition. This was in an EPA, Environmental Protection Agency report that just came out last week. So nearly half of our waters are not in good condition. And this is the water that we drink. You know, this isn't just water that's lying out there somewhere. It's really important water. And it really, for our own sakes, needs to be in good condition, never mind biodiversity. Populations of important groups of species like birds and bees and butterflies that we've been monitoring over time have all declined. And over half of Ireland's native plant species have declined in range, which means that the area that they cover has contracted, and or abundance, which is the number of them that are out there. So these are all really worrying signs. Biodiversity is a complicated thing. We measure it in lots of different ways, but all of the metrics at the moment, or the vast majority of them, are going in the wrong direction. So our job as ecologists, my own discipline, is to understand the effects of global change on biodiversity and different elements of biodiversity that are out there. And then we also like to try and develop effective solutions. So what is it that we can do, but through this better understanding of ecology and the effects of the environment on it, how can we develop better and more effective solutions? So we have available to us very important compilations of evidence on both the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis through the Intergovernmental Science Policy Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES for short, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. Both of these are scientific bodies. Researchers have put together huge quantities of evidence showing the nature of the crisis in terms of climate and in terms of biodiversity, and pointing out what kinds of actions are needed. And the early work in biodiversity and climate change kind of happened in parallel. And they did reference the other occasionally within these reports. But then I think back in 2020, there was a joint workshop between the IPBES and the IPCC, which formally brought together the linkage between biodiversity and climate change, and really helped to progress this idea that we need to tackle these crises in an integrated way. So there are shared drivers of both the biodiversity and climate change crises. So we have invasive species, which change biodiversity. So things like the Asian hornet, which you might have heard about recently, coming in. So it's from Asia, it's not native to Ireland, it's come into the UK and Ireland, and Asian hornets eat in other kinds of insects. And there's over 100 species have been found in the Asian hornet's diet, if you actually analyze what they're eating. So they're eating a lot of native species, and they are prolific predators. And there's when you bring a new species into a place where it hasn't occurred before, it's lacking its own predators and its own diseases, so it can get out of control. So things like the Asian hornet are threatening biodiversity. We have direct exploitation and over-harvesting. Things like, if you think about our marine fish stocks, for example, recently there's been some controversial evidence has come to light in the mackerel stocks. Mackerel stocks are severely depleted off the coast of Ireland, and that's leading to calls for fish quotas to be changed, and that will seriously restrict mackerel fishing because of over-harvesting and other stressors on those populations. And then we have things like pollution. Again, recently in the River Blackwater, very close to where I come from, there was a major pollution event that killed over 40,000 fish And we still don't know where that pollution has come from, but we know that there are many pollution sources in that river that need to be addressed. And then land and sea use change also contribute to biodiversity change and loss. And this is where we convert one land use into another. So for example, if we take a forest and we cut down the trees and we convert it into some other kind of land use like cropland or pasture, that's a huge land use change that can severely impact on biodiversity. More subtle land use changes, and the ones that we more commonly see here in Ireland now, we did all of our deforestation a long time ago. The more subtle land use changes that we see now are something like converting semi-natural grassland into an intensively managed grassland by adding fertilizer and reseeding it and sowing it with particularly productive species, so that you end up with just a monoculture of one species of grass instead of the 30 or 40 or 50 species that were there before. So we have very good evidence that land and sea use change can severely impact on biodiversity. And then we also see pollution. So in this case, it would be carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxides, the really important greenhouse gases being put up into the atmosphere that impact on climate change. And then again, we see land and sea use change as being major drivers of climate change. Deforestation, the destruction of our bogs, the draining of organic peat soils. All of these things have an implication for climate change because our natural ecosystems are really important for regulating the climate. So one of the most important critical feedbacks between biodiversity and climate is that regulation, the drawing down of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere that plants do. They pull it down from the atmosphere and they lock it away into their bodies, so into the trunks of trees and into organic matter in the soil. So our peat bogs, which can be many, many meters deep, are the non-decomposed remains of plants that have occurred in those bogs over thousands of years, sometimes for the very deepest peats. And so all that carbon is locked away into biological material, and it can stay locked away for long periods of time. In the case of peat bogs, if those peat bogs are healthy, if they're wet, that means, and they're not exploited, that means that carbon stays locked away, and a peat bog can continue to draw down carbon dioxide from the air and lock it away. So this helps us in the climate side of the house, because if we remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, that reduces the greenhouse gas effect that carbon dioxide has. But equally, there's another feedback, which is where as the climate changes, it has an impact on biodiversity. So rapid climate change that occurs far more rapidly than evolution can keep up with can make some species no longer adapted to where they occur. So that might mean that in Ireland, we might get fewer frost days, for example. And for a lot of species of plants, a period of cold is needed in order to stimulate them to germinate. So if they don't get enough of that cold weather, then they won't germinate and the populations will go down, and ultimately that species might disappear. And equally, our warmer, hotter summers might cause drought, and some plant species and some animals might not do very well under these drought conditions. So you can see that as the climate changes, animals and plants either have to change themselves through evolution and evolutionarily adapt, or they're going to have to be move or be moved to more suitable climates. So this is very problematic, and these feedbacks, and that can then degrade. So as climate changes, as plants and animals are moving around, as ecosystems start to lose species, those ecosystems become less good at doing the climate regulation. So you have this negative feedback potentially occurring. But the good news is that there are connected solutions for both biodiversity and climate change. So we know that there's these connections between biodiversity and climate, and we know that there are connected solutions. So restoration and nature-based solutions are good for biodiversity. In the blue cross there, that's a plus sign saying, yay, good, go restoration, nature-based solutions. And a red cross means good for climate as well. So if we restore native woodlands, for example, then we have a win for biodiversity. We're creating habitat for plants and animals that can assemble within those native woodlands. We're supporting populations that are under stress elsewhere. And those woodlands draw down carbon dioxide, lock it away into their bodies, and help with the climate regulation that we need. Afforestation. So afforestation can be positive or negative for biodiversity, depending on what kind of forest you're putting in. So this is forest which is going into areas that currently don't have forest. So it can be done in a way that is very good for biodiversity by encouraging the natural regeneration of native woody plant species, or planting in some of those woody plant species. Or it can be done in a way that's negative for biodiversity, which is monocultures of one particular species just grown as a crop plant for timber. That can be a poor environment for biodiversity. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't do that kind of afforestation, but we need to think about where we're doing it and how the biodiversity can be managed within those systems. Because afforestation, before we get on to that, afforestation is quite important for climate regulation. So Sitka spruce, which is the dominant forestry tree species here in Ireland, is very, very good at pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, locking it away into wood. If that wood, when it's cut down, with those trees, when they're cut down, the timber goes into long-lived products like houses, you know, wood timber framed houses or long-lived furniture, then that carbon is locked away and stored, and you grow another Sitka spruce tree in its place. So it can be good for climate as well. However, there can be some problems with that kind of forestry system for the climate, and particularly where these forests are planted on peat soils and deep peat soils, where the peat soils end up getting drained in order to support forestry. And in fact, that leads to the release of greenhouse gases from those peat soils, which can be more than the carbon that you're locking away out of the atmosphere through the growth of the trees. So it can be a bit of a balancing act around where best to plant those forests to get the maximum climate impact, and how best to manage those forests to get the maximum benefit for biodiversity. And then we have sustainable food systems, which again, a food system which feeds people, produces lots of good, healthy food, can be good for climate change. It can be good for biodiversity. An example of this, and this isn't the only solution, but one example is organic systems, which organic crop systems, which use less pesticides, better for biodiversity, and plant-based foods in particular are particularly good for addressing the climate challenge, because you can feed a lot more people on from a patch of land which is put under beans and peas and lentils and you know other kinds of plant-based foods. It takes a lot more land to feed the same number of people if you're feeding them meat, because animal production is an inefficient conversion of plants to nutrients. You lose a lot through that process. So plant-based diets, good for climate, good for biodiversity, because the way that you farm can be good for biodiversity, but the amount of land that you use if you're eating a plant-based diet is much, much less, which leaves more space for nature in our landscapes. And then renewable energy, again, it can be good for climate, well, absolutely is good for climate change, because we need to shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy in order to stop this huge output of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide primarily, into the atmosphere, which is really driving climate change. We need to move away from that system, and renewable energy is the way to move away from that system. However, there can be some negative impacts of renewable energy installations for biodiversity, again, depending on where you put them and how you design them and all of that. In particular, we worry about things like birds and bats impacting with the turbines, but there can be other elements of biodiversity damage that get done during the construction of these installations. And it depends as well how much land is being used for renewable energy, solar and wind in particular. And we need to look to try and make these as efficient as possible. So to reduce the amount of land that's under renewable energy, and then also to manage those renewable energy installations in a way that has benefits for biodiversity. So there's lots of things you can do within a wind farm, within a solar farm, in order to make it better for biodiversity. And we need to find those solution spaces that are positive for both, because the alternative scenario of continuing to emit fossil fuels will be far, far worse for biodiversity than renewable energy installations. Okay, so one of the research questions that we were really interested in was how land use and climate compare as drivers of species distributions. And hopefully when I tell you this little research story, you'll understand why we think this is important. So this is some work done by postdoctoral research fellow in my lab, Caroline McKeown. And we were interested in which plant species are where and why. We had access to a fantastic database called the Predicts database, put together over the last few years, which compiles biodiversity. We use the plant data here, compiles plant species occurrences and abundances in lots of different sites worldwide. Now these sites are in the same area, so we might have 4 or 5 sites in the same area that only differ in terms of their land use, but they're in the same climate. So by using this database, we have a contrast between the biodiversity that's occurring in different climates, and then within the same climate, the biodiversity that occurs between land uses. And that enables us to basically quantify the effect of climate moving from one place in the world to another under a different climatic condition, the effect that has on biodiversity compared to the effect of land use moving from one land use to another within the same climate. And it enables us to look at the magnitude of those effects on biodiversity and compare them. So which is bigger, the effect of climate or the effect of land use? We do this by using a nice classification of plants, which was developed by Ronkear, who is a Danish botanist and poet, I believe, back in the day, in the early 1900s. And what Ronkear did was he classified plants into these different life forms, from this life form here,